There are those who dream of a better world. Those who strive to climb higher, swim deeper, and venture further than the rest. We call them DaVincis. We marvel at their genius and are awed by their unbreakable spirit. Here they come. Stand back and watch as they inspire the human race by living a DaVinci life.
How's it going, guys? It's Rusty Johnson from A DaVinci Life. Thanks for stopping in. Today's guest is really one of my favorites. This guy is named David Holthouse. Now, David, I've been a huge fan of for a very long time, but I didn't know it. The way I ran into him just recently was about 2 months ago. I was watching the movie Sasquatch on Hulu. It's a really, really cool movie. You got to check it out. There's a real big twist to everything. And he's the star of that movie. And throughout the movie, they kind of did a flashback of what he's done in his life. And he's a reporter, but he's one that participates in it. He embeds himself. He was embedded with meth addicts for like 72 hours without sleeping, gangs, even embedded, not embedded, actually undercover for a couple of years with neo-Nazis and skinheads. And I said, man, this guy's, he does some really raw stories, so I got to get him on the show. So I started to look further into him. And that's when I think my mind exploded, because I realized I've been a fan of this guy for the longest time. Literally, like the last 6 documentaries that I've been addicted to, that I've seen 4, 5, 6 times, he's done. For example, he's done the Last Narc, which is a fantastic one on Netflix. He's done Lorena, the Lorena Bobbitt story. Yeah, feel a little tingle you got down there, guys? It's funny how that happens, don't it? Ugh. The 7-5, which the 7-5 is about the most corrupt police precinct in New York City back in the early 80s. You got to see that one too. Operation Odessa as well. That's another one where a Russian mobster goes to buy a sub for a Colombian cartel. And if that's not crazy enough, I don't want to ruin the story, but it gets even crazier than that. So check that one out too. So I realized, man, this guy's right up my alley on the stuff that I like, so I have to catch up with him. And he was gracious enough to come on the show. It really was a jaw dropper, because aside from all these amazing, crazy things that he's done, he also told me a tragic story that back when he was 7 years old, that he was threatened by a guy with a samurai sword in the basement and raped. And he didn't tell anybody for decades. Now he's talking about it. And the twist to that story as well is that he actually made a very detailed plan on how to seek revenge on his attacker, which we will talk about as well. But check him out. Not only has he done amazing stuff, I see even more amazing stuff down the road for him. So enjoy. David Holthouse.
Hey, man.
Hey, David, how you doing today?
Hey.
Hey, thanks a lot for coming on, man. I'm so glad we connected.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad. I know it took a minute to get it together, but yeah, I'm happy to talk. I just had a couple days of downtime, so I'm ready to go.
Perfect, man. Where are you now?
I live in. Are we doing this right now, or?
Yeah, sure. If you want, we can just start up right now. We keep it casual.
I'll tell you. I just I try to keep my location a little bit on the DL, so I'd say like on the record in the Four Corners region of like Southwest US.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Actually, you know what? That'll kick off really the first question. Have you ever gotten retaliation for any of your stories?
Threats. Never any actual retaliation. Just threats.
Wow.
And I'll tell you though, when I worked at the Southern Poverty Law Center, especially, we used to get these threats from neo-Nazis that would go something like this. You Jew-loving, race traitor. When we get our hands in the levers of power in this country, it's going to be what they call the day of the rope. And on the day of the rope, we're keeping a list, and you're on it. And we still kind of laugh it off. I mean, you got to have kind of a dark sense of humor in that line of work. I'll tell you, in the last few years, that's gotten to be less humorous.
Yeah, it seems now as time passes, a lot of those threats could be a little bit more believable.
Well, yeah, especially in the last few years.
Yeah.
Especially in the last few years. I mean, I just remember, on January 6th, right, when I was watching what was going on in DC and with the crowds around the state capitol buildings in several states, I had those threats, crossed my mind for sure.
Yeah.
I was keeping a very close eye on how things progressed.
Absolutely. It's been a strange world, man, and seems to be getting stranger. But on to you, man. I have been a huge fan of yours and actually didn't even know it for a while. I was kicking through Hulu a couple months ago. I came across Sasquatch. So let me check this out. Man, I absolutely love it. Total twist of what I thought it was going to be. Matter of fact, last night I saw it for the third time. I saw it twice before I even connected with you. But when I first saw it, I'm like, man, this guy is cool as hell, man. I love the stories that you've done in the past. These undercover investigations with the Aryan Brotherhood and the Mill Rats and White Like Me, 72-hour Party and people and all that.
You've gone deep.
Oh, yeah. And I said, you know what? I want him on the show. So let me check him out. And then I saw it was just blew my mind because like the last 3 or 4 documentaries that I got hooked on, you worked on.
Right.
And
Nice.
I'm like, oh, now this I gotta have this guy on. So thanks so much, man. For instance, the Last Narc, absolutely love it. 7-5, dude, those guys are out of control, man. What the hell is that about? What are some of your takeaways from those documentaries? Like when you got done with doing the Last Narc.
Well, first of all, man, I'm glad that you brought that one up because that doc, although it never found its audience in the same way that some of the other docs that I've worked on recently have. I feel I'm really happy that you name checked that one because I really feel like that has not gotten the attention that it deserved. Frankly, the CIA brought some pressure to bear on Amazon just before that doc was going to be released. And I think that it scared them off from promoting it as heavily as they might have otherwise. That was a story that, the last time that was a story that I've been chasing in one form or another since the mid 1990s. I mean, there was sort of this order, if you will, of border journalists based in Arizona and Texas during that era. And our leader really was this guy named Chuck Bowden, who was based in Tucson, who to this day he's deceased now, but to this day is sort of my favorite writer. He was my mentor at the time. And that story being that the CIA had been complicit, if not directly involved, in the murder of a DEA agent named Kiki Camarena in the mid 80s in Guadalajara. There was, tendrils of information that started leaking out in the mid 90s, and we were all sort of chasing on it and working on it. We were competing journalists, so we weren't working in direct cooperation, but at the same time, we shared a devotion to thinking that the truth needed to come out in that story. So it was very satisfying to me to finally be a part of bringing that story to light. Finally, again, that story being, it's really Last Narc. It's really a few things. One thing it's the origin story of the drug cartels in Mexico, and the origin story of the drug war in Mexico, because it's the story of the rise and fall of the first drug cartel, the Guadalajara cartel, and what set in motion that cartel disintegrating and creating a power vacuum that was then filled by the first sort of batch of competing cartels that gave rise eventually 3 decades later to, the horrific violence that we see today. What set in motion the downfall of the Guadalajara cartel was the death of Kiki Camarena, this DEA agent, who I believe was killed because he had stumbled across, without really knowing it, evidence that the CIA was involved in trafficking cocaine in the US as part of supporting the Contras in Nicaragua, which is something that other investigative journalists have come at that story from different angles over the years. But I think that we made a pretty good case that Kiki Camarena was murdered because without setting out to investigate that, just in the process of investigating the Guadalajara cartel, he stumbled across evidence of the CIA landing cocaine at transshipment points, which were basically jungle air bases that were controlled by the Guadalajara cartel. And that's what got him killed.
What got me with that documentary, and when I know that I love it, is at the end, while the credits are rolling, you're just staring at TV. Like what the fuck? Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
It seemed fictional.
Right. Yeah, no, it's
But
all too real, and yeah, we had some late breaking information, like late in the game. We got a hold of the source that there's a phone call with him near the very end of the show, that really was kind of the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. I'll just say it that way without spoiling it for those who haven't seen it. But yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, man, because I'm as proud of that doc and telling that story as I am of anything that I've done in my entire career.
yeah.
And again, it's frustrating sometimes to see to really put your heart into something and for it not to get the same sort of attention as you may think that it deserves.
And that DEA agent, is it Hector was his name?
Hector Berreyes, yeah.
Man, what a set of balls on that guy, man.
I know, like he was a true believer in the war on drugs. His little brother was a junkie in Tucson, and when Hector finished his military service during the Vietnam War era, he came back home and found his little brother was a junkie, and he decided to be a cop and take on the drug dealers. And he was like a, bleed red, white, and blue kind of guy. Joined the DEA, just had all of his ideals shattered in the process of fighting the quote unquote war on drugs. And he'll tell you right now, there never was any war on drugs. It was a facade from the jump, and he spent his whole life essentially chasing a mirage.
Yeah. I mean, this guy, and even not to spoil the story, but I have to talk about it. When this man is in the midst of one of the biggest DEA shootouts ever, a bunch of guys get shot up. He goes to take him to the hospital, and in the middle of the street, he leaves, he hijacks a taxi and goes back to the shootout.
Right. Yeah. He commandeered a taxi and drove the taxi. And there's a funny kicker to that story too. And we're not giving anything away there. I mean, he won like the highest, I think it was Medal of Valor. That's what it was. The Justice Department Medal of Valor, which is basically the highest honor you can win as a federal law enforcement agent. He got for being involved in that gun battle and saving the lives of some Mexican soldiers and fellow DEA agents. So yeah, he drove some wounded guys away from the gun battle in one of the pickups that they drove into the ambush, and then commandeered a taxi cab to drive back to the gunfight. The taxi cab just got riddled with bullets. I mean, it got shot to shit. And a few weeks later, the taxi driver showed up at the DEA headquarters, which was in the consulate office, basically demanding payment for his taxi. So Hector had this very funny story about how he had to get on the phone with the ambassador to Mexico at the time and get payment authorized to pay off this guy for his cab. And then the guy came back a few weeks later and was like, "Can I buy the cab back now?" And so he bought it back for less than he'd been paid for it. And then Hector saw it a few weeks later, on the street, which is Bondo covering all the bullet.
Oh man.
Yeah, he turned it back into a working cab. So that's one of those only in Mexico kind of things.
Yeah. But I love too when he came back in the cab and the shooting stopped.
Right. Because it was just like, what the fuck?
Then he gets out, "Oh, it's me."
Yeah. 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 There's just thousands and thousands of rounds expended in that gun battle.
Yeah, that was a jaw dropper. Also, too, is the 7.5. I'm from New York, and I knew back during those times in the 70s and the 80s, NYPD kind of extended the reach that they really should have. But damn, what a set of balls these guys had.
That story, it started off, and the director I worked with on the Last Narc and 7.5 was the same. He's a really good buddy of mine, a close collaborator named Tilla Russell. And he and I were initially hired to make a documentary that was about the Mullen Commission. And Mullen Commission was this series of hearings into corruption in the New York Police Department. It took place in the 1980s. And so it was sort of a subject-oriented doc project. And then I had this very clear memory of he flew to New York a couple of days before I did on one of our first research trips. And he met Michael Dowd, who was the ringleader of this one group of cops in the 75th precinct, hence the name the 7.5 in the mid 80s. And at the time, this is ironic for anybody who's seen the film, Michael Dowd was working security for the US Open tennis tournament in New York. So Tiller met him, and that night he like came to me and he was just on fire, and he was like, forget the Mullen Commission. The doc we're going to make is on this guy and his crew of guys. Michael Dowd hadn't seen most of them since they all got busted. But they just, they went from being cops to being gangsters in the space of about 2 years after getting out of the police academy and being stationed at the 75th precinct, which at the time was like the most dangerous police precinct in the country, like by far, right? Mm-hmm. These cops just like, they got very quickly corrupted. And so that's how that doc came together, and then Mike basically helped us sort of get the gang back together, And where Tiller and I were a couple times, we were like, fuck, like if these guys like start robbing banks or like doing crimes again together, we're going to bear partial responsibility for this, because they're just stone cold gangsters. All of them. They're just stone cold gangsters that happen to be cops.
Yeah. And fearless.
Yes. Well, they had reason to be fearless. They had badges.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a helpful thing to have if you're a gangster, is a police badge.
Yeah.
That's real.
The Nightstalker. Now, this guy here, he has a connection with me. I've corresponded for a long time with the Nightstalker.
Really?
And that guy is out of his freaking mind, man. Matter of fact, check this out. This is one of the letters he wrote me.
Oh, yeah. I recognize that imagery. Man, what led you to correspond with him?
Well, my entire life, I worked with predators. I started off with reptiles, venomous snakes, birds of prey. I've had eagles, hawks, falcons, condors, all that stuff, and worked with predators my entire life. I used to work with Jim Fowler, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, but I never studied a human predator. So I wrote him, and I was really clear about it. I said, hey, listen, this is what I do for a living. I study predators. Clearly, dude, you're a predator. And I just like to study a human predator for once. Would you mind if we corresponded? So about 3 weeks later, he writes me a letter, and it said, sure, I'll talk to you. If you could send me stamps and send me pics of chicks, preferably Asian, and please include their feet.
Very specific request.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I said, sure, what the hell? I went on the internet, grabbed some pics of chicks in bathing suits. He couldn't have anything nude. They were in bathing suits, and sent him stamps and would correspond back and forth. Now, initially, I thought I was going to really pick his brain and get some type of like complicated Manson-esque responses from why he did what he did. And man, he just reminded me of like Beavis and Butthead. He did nothing.
You just nailed it. You just nailed it. When we were working on that, we said lots. I was like, I know this guy. This is like the burnout stoner guy from high school, just gone like really wrong, But he was like yes, I knew that guy in high school, 100%. He was Beavis and Butthead. Yeah, but you know what? He was doing coke intravenously, right? He was shooting coke, and that's when he would go out and do all this stuff. So for that guy, whatever particular psychological components he had, when you added, banging coke into your vein, it just like sent him to a really dark predatory place, right?
Yeah.
When he was listening to interviews with him or reading letters that he's written over the years, I mean, he was just like that. Yeah, just that guy in high school that you know.
And the evil. I mean, even here he has. He either would sign his name with instead of sincerely, it's 666, or he would write, "Take it sleazy."
Yeah.
But his uncle, man, his uncle
threw
him up, man. The things his uncle did in Vietnam and showed him the photos of the horrific things he did, I think that stuck with him, and it just propagated from there.
Yeah. He had some, and he saw his uncle kill his wife, his aunt. He witnessed that firsthand when he was pretty young too. That was one of his formative experiences. So, I think with all these guys, and that's one of the cops, Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno, that helped catch the Nightstalker, and who were really the sort of central characters in that doc series. Salerno, he said something. He was just like, he sort of believes that people like that, they're just evil from the jump. They're just sort of born that way. That a certain number of human beings are just they come into the world sort of predestined to be that sort of predator. That's his take on, that they're born, not made. And there may be something to that. I mean, you can look at the things that happened in Ramirez's upbringing, his childhood years, and you can sort of point to that. But I guess with the cops that catch these guys, sometimes there's really no point in getting too wound up and trying to figure them out. You just got to catch them and put them away. It's kind of how they come at it. But I have mixed feelings about that. That show was a big success in terms of viewership, and I know it's a good show. But in the making of it, a lot of times you're like, man, what are we doing here? And especially once the show came out and Netflix has got billboards up, over Sunset Boulevard with like his face in it. It's all cool and it's in shadow. It's not just like a mugshot of Ramirez or something. But the truth is, that fucking guy, he would have loved that, right? Yeah. So knowing that we were making a show and we were trying to make sure that the victims seemed real, and we made an effort to really give a substantial amount of real estate on screen to any survivor or any surviving family member of one of his victims that would speak to us. That was important to us. And I think that we achieved that the victims are more than just names and numbers,
Yeah.
But even so, like, we knew, like, he would have loved this. He would have loved the fact that there would be a Netflix series about his reign of terror or his terrorizing the city of Los Angeles that one particular summer. And, to this day, I, speaking for myself, but I think I'm speaking for the entire crew, we have pretty mixed feelings about that show.
Yeah, I agree. He had an ego, and sometimes I was always wondering if it was a show. I mean, obviously he's a heinous monster, but the pageantry of the devil, the 666, having the sunglasses and the pentagram on his hand, he liked the pageantry of it too.
Well, my take on it is he bought into the persona that the media created for him. Like, true, he really loved it. He loved the like Nightstalker moniker, and he'd left a pentagram at a crime scene, and that got picked up on. But I think he was just like, the Satanism stuff was just sort of like, it was like a 1980s heavy metal variety of Satanism. Like, if you look at the videos, like Motley Crue, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, it's this cartoonish Satanism, right? I mean, it drove some fundamentalist Christians out of their fucking minds in the 80s, right? It drove them crazy. But it was all sort of like marketing of a cartoonish image of Satanism. That's the brand of Satanism that I think he kind of bought into, was like 80s heavy metal cartoon Satanism. But once the media picked up on it and turned it into something darker and more serious, he was like, oh, okay, I can do that. I can be the really scary Satanist guy too. So
I got no more than Beavis and Butthead vibe out of him. Yeah. And it was always, because of my appeals, I can't really discuss that. I'm like, dude, you got 15 death sentences against you, man. Even if they took away 14, you're still dying. Ended up dying of liver failure, actually, before they killed him. But
yeah, I know some of the survivors, they like thinking of him dying in prison of cancer rather than being put to sleep. So and
that's a little poetic justice right there.
Yeah.
Now your stories, especially in your early days, real raw, man. You did a lot of undercover work. Explain some of the undercover work that you did.
Yeah, most of the undercover. So I draw a distinction between working undercover and embedding. So a lot of the stories I did where I would embed with, say, street gang or homeless gutter punks or crystal meth heads, they knew at a certain point, they knew I was a journalist. They may have already accepted me into their world. And then I said, by the way, I'm a reporter, but it wasn't undercover in that sense. The straight up undercover work I did was specific to like neo-Nazi groups, skinheads, white nationalist groups, things like that. And that sort of kicked off in 2002. I did a story where I went undercover as a neo-Nazi skinhead to report on an event called the Rocky Mountain Heritage Fest, which was a pretty significant neo-Nazi gathering, semi-underground neo-Nazi gathering in Colorado. At the time, I was based in Denver. Writing for the Westward, which is an alternative weekly paper. So I went into that story thinking it was going to be a one-off, meaning I thought I would like pose as a neo-Nazi skinhead, go in, get the story, come out and move on with my career. But once I got a look at the neo-Nazi movement, and it was eye-opening. It was much better organized, much better financed, and much more serious than I thought going in. I was expecting a bunch of clowns, and there is a clown car element to that movement, especially with the Ku Klux Klan. Mm-hmm. But these are like serious cats that had serious intentions about taking over the U.S. government, and I just was rattled, and I wanted to, and I was telling everybody that I could, like, more attention needs to be paid to these groups, because at that time it was only a year past 9/11, and all anybody wanted to talk about in terms of a domestic terrorist threat was domestic jihadis, right? Domestic jihadist guys, right? And I was like, I think that the FBI and the federal government is making a mistake by not paying the same sort of attention to these groups that was paid in the immediate aftermath of the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing of the federal building that was carried out by Timothy McVeigh and his accomplices, right? So I just sensed that there was a pervasive danger that was going unheeded. And so I started doing more stories for weekly papers that were owned by the same company I worked for instance, in Arizona, where I would sort of parachute in, not literally, but figuratively parachute into that city for a week, go undercover as a neo-Nazi and report on whatever was going on in the neo-Nazi world in that city. And so I did that for a few years, and then was recruited by the Southern Poverty Law Center to come and work for them full time, doing investigative reporting on hate groups, white power hate groups in the U.S. and Europe. So,
is their mindset still of the kind of the German Nazi mindset of ethnic diversity is ruining this country, or has it evolved to other issues?
Well, I think what's animating them right now, and when I say them, I mean let's just say that, broadly speaking, it's white nationalism. And white nationalism is basically the ideology that the United States is by and for white people. Okay, that it's a nation that should be controlled by white people for the primary benefit of white people. Some white nationalists may differ on whether that means that all white people should be deported, murdered, kept under control, legally, whatever. But it's like the overriding philosophy is that this country is by and for white people. And what's animating white nationalists now is kind of a return to where it was in the mid 2000s, which it's all about immigration, non-white immigration, specifically like on the southern border of the U.S. I think that's what's going to be animating them for the next few years. Now, within the white nationalist movement, there's one faction that's neo-Nazi, that's very much like Hitler worshiping, straight up. Hitler got it right, and the Jews are responsible for all of the problems of the world, neo-Nazism. Okay, so that's there.
Your mill rat story, what was that about?
Mill rats. So I lived in Tempe, Arizona. I was reporting for the Phoenix New Times. This is in the 90s, and but I lived in Tempe, and every winter I would notice that there was this sort of influx of these, call them what you will, young homeless people, gutter punks, street punks, kids, that they had a certain look. And a lot of times they had what I call dog on a rope, which is they'd have a dog that had a rope, for a leash. And they would show up on Mill Avenue, which was the sort of the main drag near the Arizona State University campus in Tempe. And they would show up and they would hang out there, and they would do what they call spanging, which is like basically panhandling, like spare any change, that's spanging. And I just saw them, and I was just like, man, what are their stories? I was just curious. And there was the local slang for them was, instead of gutter punks or street punks, the local slang was mill rats, because they hung out on Mill Avenue, at least during the day. And so, I was young enough at the time that I could go down, and I didn't exactly pose as one of them, but I just started hanging out and just talking to them and introduced myself. And then after a couple of days had gone by, I was like, look, I'm a journalist. I write for this paper, the Phoenix New Times, which at the time, was everywhere around there on Mill Avenue in stacks every week. I said, I'd like to do a story on like your scene and your culture and everything. And that kicked off, about a month-long period of actually living with them as they lived. So living homelessly, like on the streets in Tempe, sleeping in caves. A lot of them slept in caves in this nearby desert park called Papago Park. Or there was this abandoned grain silo where a lot of them would crash, and I would crash there at night. So I was, that was a good one, man. That was a good story. I'm glad that you name checked that one. But that was like I wasn't undercover exactly. I mean, I
Right.
just sort of worked my way into their scene, and then unmasked myself as a reporter once they'd already gotten comfortable with my presence.
Mhm.
And then that allowed me to write about their lives and their subculture in a way that if I just approached them right off the bat as a reporter, dressed like a 9-to-5 guy with a
Yeah,
notebook,
right.
I never would have gotten in with them.
Now, what was it like doing the 72-hour party people? The tweakers freak me out, man. That must have been a
Well,
trip.
I knew that, I mean, a lot of those people were friends of mine. So 72-hour party people is a story where I mostly stayed up. I mean, there were parts where I nodded off, to be honest, but not for very long. Tried to stay up for 72 hours straight with these tweakers, but what made it an interesting story, and this was a story that I did in Denver, is that they were not your typical tweakers, meaning they had money, they had dough, and
Oh, okay.
they were either friends of mine or friends of friends. So they weren't the same sort of like crystal meth users that I was encountering, say, when I was doing the series Sasquatch for Hulu.
Like the toothless and the ruthless, as you
Yes,
said.
these are not the toothless and the ruthless. Like they have money for dentists kind of thing, But they were doing this thing where every once a month they would smoke this really high grade crystal meth called shabu. It's called shabu because in like Japanese steakhouses, is a really thinly sliced version of steak, called shabu.
Mhm.
And so the slang for this meth is called shabu because it comes in usually in like form of a statue, like the crystal shaped in the form of a statue, and you just slice like very thin pieces off the statue, and then you smoke them. So that's how they were using this stuff. And I was using, I mean, I think there's probably is a contact high when that many people are smoking crystal meth around you.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I was taking a drug called modafinil, or Provigil is the brand name, which is used to treat narcolepsy, but also like the military gives it to pilots instead of amphetamines these days because it will keep you up without giving you the sort of high or rush or aggression of amphetamines. So I was popping that stuff like Tic Tacs to try and stay up with them.
Keep up with them.
Yeah. So that's what that story was about.
Yeah. Now, when you work in so many deep stories and dark stories, have you ever had an issue where you've gone too deep, almost to where you kind of get sucked in, or are you able to really just kind of keep your distance and the story's over when it's over and you move on?
I think for the most part, I've kept my distance. I mean, there's been there were times when I was working undercover in the neo-Nazi world where I felt like I had to kind of give myself over to the camaraderie at an event. I mean, it's like, shirtless guys swilling beer and Sieg Heiling a Nazi flag. You want to pass, you kind of got to get down with that.
Yeah, you got to fit in.
Yeah, and you kind of have to, there's a certain like universally human desire to be a part of a group and to have like the affirmation of like other people around you that you're cool, right? And that's what I think a lot of skinheads especially are drawn to the movement in that. So, but there are a few times, to answer your question, where I would come out of an undercover assignment in that world and be like, whoa, like what was that? Because for a minute there, I was really enjoying being a skinhead and hanging out with those other skinheads. And how I mean, I think this is not just a justification, but how I explained it to myself was you gotta give yourself over to that sort of like rush of brotherhood that they're experiencing in order to seem like you belong there. But it was a rush. It was a rush. That whole experience was a rush.
Yeah.
So
it's no different than Undercover Cop. Like Hector said, when he was undercover, it was a lot of times some of those guys he kind of liked better than the cops he worked with.
Right. Well, I think to be a good undercover cop, you have to be half a crook yourself. Right.
Yeah. You've said actually since a young age that you've always gotten along very well with criminals, and criminals have gotten along very well with you.
Yeah, I think for sure. Why? Well, let me say, if I hadn't been a journalist, I would have been a crook of some kind. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of the years that I was practicing journalism, I was kind of half a crook myself. I mean, to answer your early question, there were some times where I got involved in criminal activity that I originally came across in the course of reporting a story. Okay. Mm-hmm. And part of it was that was a way to further gain the trust of key sources for that story and for future stories. And part of it was like, I just enjoyed the criminal activity. As to why that is, I can trace a direct line between a lot of the journalism that I've practiced and that sort of mutual attraction that I've had with criminals to being sexually assaulted when I was 7 years old. And that may not seem logical, but to me, it makes sense because how that manifested in me and how it's very typical for survivors, victims, call them what you will, of that sort of childhood sexual trauma to have a lot of anger, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes that anger is directed outward at other people, and those people become victimizers themselves. And sometimes that anger is directed inward, and people have very self-destructive tendencies, and I did have some of those, but how it manifested in me was just a sort of profound attraction to darkness and to behavior that falls well outside the norm and to danger. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. I can see step by step how my life progressed, and it starts like, in a certain basement at the age of 7.
And you wrote about that in Stalking the Boogeyman. And in there, you admitted that at one point you stalked him and you planned on killing him.
I would have killed him And what stopped me, as anybody who's read the essay knows, is that my mom found a diary that I'd kept when I was a kid, and a matter of weeks, if not days, before I was going to carry out this murder, confronted me with the diary and was like, is this true? And that's the way I wrote the story, because that's the way I thought it happened. My mom found the diary and confronted me, and this happened to fall just, again, a few weeks, if not days, before I was going to kill this guy. And because I was surprised, I admitted to her that it was true, that this particular individual had raped me when I was 7, in 1978. So from that point forward, I abandoned the murder plot and decided to write about it instead. But what I found out years later is that my mom had actually found that diary a couple of years before she confronted me with it. And what that speaks to is just like this continuing like stigma and shame that people feel around being sexually assaulted when they're children, or around the whole issue of childhood sexual abuse and sexual assault, right? It's just like, it's uncomfortable, and it's sort of impolite really to speak about it openly, to the point where my mom sort of sat on this diary for years before she could sort of muster the courage to ask me about it. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know that at the time. I just sort of assumed that she had found the diary and then almost immediately like called me up to ask me about it. And so that's the way I wrote the piece. So I just want to offer that as sort of a correction, I guess, to the original essay. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I was pretty dead set on, I was a different person. I mean, this is going back a while now, right? Mm-hmm. But I remember keeping the sexual assault, keeping the rape a secret my entire life, up all the way through my middle 30s. And it really bothered me in my teens because I was really afraid that I was going to have the desire to hurt children. Mm-hmm. And to the point where I plotted, the first death I plotted very carefully was my own. Like I plotted to commit suicide in a certain way on a certain mountain that would look like an accident, like within a few days, if I ever started to feel like I wanted to sexually assault kids, to be blunt about it. I was like, I was not going to live like that, because I felt like, and I feel to this day, a lot of people, especially men who are sexually assaulted when they're kids, like they feel like it was like something gets passed on like a curse. And it doesn't have to be that at all. Mm-hmm. And then I sort of come to terms with it all throughout my 20s. And in my early 30s, I was living in Denver. And I found out that individual, the man who raped me when I was a child, lived nearby in a suburb of Denver. And it was like I was hit with full-on PTSD symptoms, like all at once, like flashbacks, nightmares, adrenaline rushes, paranoia, like all of it at once. I didn't know at the time what was going on. I thought I was losing my mind, which frankly I probably was. Right. But as soon as I started to think about killing him, it had a calming effect, and those symptoms started to subside, and I was able to kind of function but then at a certain point, like just thinking about killing him wasn't enough. And I actually had to start sort of plotting it in order to maintain that same level of calm. But it was sort of an empty calm. It wasn't a pleasant calm. It was more like a void, but it was better than the full-on frenzy of full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. Nice. So yeah, I think I was actually going to do it. I'm really happy that I didn't. I think, most days, more days than not, I'm happy that I didn't. It pains me to think that he may have gone on to, that he could possibly be victimizing other children right now. That pains me sometimes, because I think that that's possible. But mostly
I read that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, just mostly I made my peace with it.
Now, I heard, did he apologize to you at one point?
He did.
Did that matter at all?
I wrote him a letter about 2 weeks before we were going to publish the piece, maybe 3 weeks. I sent him a letter. I didn't tell him that I was writing this article for the Westward, but I sent him a letter that basically said, I remember, what happened in that basement in 1978, and we need to talk about it. Not in those exact words, but that was pretty close. I basically was like, just ignoring this letter isn't going to work. If you don't reach out to me, like, I'm going to start showing up on your front door, have a conversation with your wife. So he got back to me like really quite soon after getting the letter. And I think, we set a meeting, maybe 2 days later, and we met on the 16th Street Mall in downtown Denver. And he did apologize. Yeah, he apologized profusely. And he also swore that I was the only person that he'd ever hurt like that as a child. Because I didn't totally believe him, but because I was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, I did not name him in the original essay I wrote about all this called Stalking the Boogeyman. Years later, I was contacted by other people that told me, and I believed them, that they had also been sexually assaulted, or that they had firsthand knowledge of other people who'd been sexually assaulted by the same guy in Alaska at around the same time. And so at that point, I wrote a follow-up essay that's called Outing the Boogeyman, in which I did name him. Because I warned him right before the Westward piece, Stalking the Boogeyman, was going to come out. I warned him, like, this essay is about to come out. It's going to be a cover story in the weekly newspaper in Denver, and your name's not in it. But if I ever find out that you were lying to me when you said that I was the only person you ever raped as a child, I'm gonna put your name out there. And so I felt like I had to make good on that threat.
Wow. And it's so traumatic for people to talk about, and it's so fantastic that you're able to, because it gets just buried under the rug too much. Through the years, the stories that I've heard, I had one person that I'm acquainted with who was being molested by his uncle, and found out years later that his parents knew, and they never said anything to him, never did anything to protect him. And then when he became an adult, he's like, my uncle was doing this to me, and why didn't you do anything? And hand to God, they said to him, oh, well, it was a different time back then.
Yeah.
I'm like, what?
Yeah.
I mean, it's horrendous. And I, like you said in Sasquatch, that every child rapist should be murdered, and
I personally,
burn in hell.
I think that's what they deserve. I would have no problem with capital punishment for child molesters, especially on the second offense, because look, they never stop. I mean, they never stop. You put them in prison, they get out, they go right back to offend or trying to offend. And that's just the truth of it. So I would have no problem with capital punishment for them, because the damage that they do ripples and has such a cost to society as it ripples through generations that this, I have no empathy for them at all.
You still want to kill him?
That's a great question, man. That's very bold of you to ask that. No, because I know I wouldn't get away with it. It was paramount to me that I'd be able to get away with it. I did not want to spend the rest of my life in prison. So, in that sense, no. And also, even though he was lying to me, and I know it now, he seemed like a very damaged, scared person. And I built him up in my mind so much, as like, I was still seeing him through my own 7-year-old eyes as like this monster that had a samurai sword and was like hurting me terribly. You know, he threatened me with the sword. I don't mean to say that he actually cut me with it, but he terrorized me into submission basically with his sword. And so it was like, and he'd been this like sort of big brother-esque figure to me. So it was the idea that this person that I looked up to and that I thought liked me and cared about me could suddenly like peel off a mask and be a monster. That's still how I was seeing him as an adult, right? As a very monstrous figure, as the boogeyman. And then when I met him in person, he just seemed kind of shrunken and damaged and scared of me. And I didn't have the same sort of murderous impulse toward him at that point. Now, years later, when I found out that he'd been lying and that he'd hurt other kids around the same time he hurt me, you know, I had the feeling that maybe I should have just shot the son of a bitch, right? Yeah. So I still have that thought from time to time, especially if he's hurting other kids now, you know. But I know I could never get away with it now. So, yeah,
writing about it, was that therapeutic for you?
Another great question. You know, I expected there to be this instant relief and catharsis because that's what's supposed to happen. That's what happens in the movies, right?
Right.
Like you tell the world about this dark secret you've been harboring, and then like from on high, there's this lightning bolt of like, bah, and the rest of your life gets easy. And that's not at all what happened. Not at all, you know. But looking back now that there's some distance, it's a definite demarcation point in my life. There's before I wrote that essay and after. And before I wrote that essay, I was incredibly reckless in the way that I lived my life. I rolled the dice with my life on a regular basis in the course of reporting stories and also just in the way I was leading my life outside of work. Not to say that I had a death wish, I just didn't place a whole lot of value on my life. After I wrote that essay, and after I heard from a lot of like fellow survivors that were like, basically, thank you for doing this, I started to look at myself and the value of my own existence in a different way that led me to take fewer chances with my life. And also just led me to make a lot of changes in my life that frankly made me a better and healthier person. It sounds a bit like a cliche, but that's what happened, you know? So it wasn't this instant like feeling of unshouldering a huge burden, but now that now it's, you know, almost 20 years since I wrote this piece. You know, another couple of years, it'll be 20 years. Now I can see it's a definite before and after, with the after being I was in a much better place than I was before I wrote it.
Now there was a play made into this, right?
Yeah, it was adapted as a play in 2013, I think is when it first had its world premiere in Asheville, North Carolina, and then was had a really good production off Broadway in New York the next year. And it's still in production. It was in Sydney, Australia, I think last summer. No, the last actual summer we had before we were all wearing masks.
The real summer.
The last real summer. Summer of 2019. It was a really solid production of the play in Sydney, Australia. So it continues to be produced. Yeah.
What's it like being depicted in something that was so traumatic for you?
It's weird, you know. It's like I was reflecting on that recently. To be in the audience of the play and to watch it myself, it's like that's the worst experience of my life, like being acted out, and there's somebody else like playing 7-year-old me going through this horrible experience. Because, you know, although the rape isn't graphically depicted, neither is it given a sort of soft treatment. Like it's pretty brutal, and it comes pretty early in the play. And then when the play is being produced, there's sometimes I reflect, like, you know, right now in Sydney or Miami or New York, there's a theater full of strangers watching the worst thing that ever happened to me acted out on stage. It's fucking weird. You know,
man, that's gotta be weird.
It is, but but I have this, sometimes it's not an ability, sometimes it's a curse, to just disassociation, which is another thing that's really common in survivors of childhood sexual trauma, is disassociation. I disassociated during the actual rape. Okay. Or meaning that I just sort of like my mind separated from my body, and I have a real clear memory of that happening, as it was a survival mechanism. I was like, this is too terrifying and too painful. I cannot deal with this. I'm going to leave my body for a while now. And when that happens and it catches me off guard, which it still does, if I'm suffering through some PTSD symptoms, one of them can be disassociation. And to like suddenly feel like your mind is separated from your body can be a very shocking experience. But I also have the ability to do it in a sort of controlled fashion that was really useful to me when working undercover or when I was in dangerous situations in the course of reporting a story. I could kind of separate from the reality a little bit to where I wasn't scared. And I could do the same thing. I know when I'm watching an actor playing 7-year-old me on stage being terrorized, I just sort of, I just disassociate just a little bit to make it bearable. So that's how I get through it.
Is it safe to say that because of this traumatic experience, it kind of was a catalyst that put you as you say, hunting monsters?
100%. I mean, I wasn't aware. It's not like when I was undercover as a neo-Nazi or when I was reporting on gangsters or something, I was like, well, I'm hunting monsters because of what happened to me when I was 7. I wasn't aware of the connection for a lot of my life. But after I wrote Stalking the Boogeyman and then sort of like started to reflect back on my life up to this point, it was like, oh, I see what I'm doing. I've been hunting monsters this whole time. I see. Got it. Yeah.
Now, speaking of hunting monsters, Sasquatch, man. Yeah. There's so many interesting things there. There's obviously, of course, Sasquatch and then the crime, but also Squatchers.
Yes.
Are they their own type of people?
Yes, they're very open-minded. And I found that I liked Squatchers a lot more than I thought I would going into making this series. Like I really kind of got along with them. Now I say that like a lot of Squatchers are pissed at that series, and they're pissed for a couple reasons. One is some of them feel like this thing's called Sasquatch and it's not really a hunt for Bigfoot show. Like they saw, there's a 3-part series on Hulu called Sasquatch. Like finally, maybe we're going to get some evidence on a major streaming platform like Hulu. Finally, maybe the hunt for Sasquatch is being taken really seriously by a major streamer like that. That's not what the show is, at all. So, and then some of them are pissed that I say in the show that I don't believe in Bigfoot, and that we had this guy as part of the program named Bob Hieronymus. He says that he was the guy in the monkey suit for the famous sort of Patterson Gimlin Sasquatch, the Bigfoot movie that we've all seen, right? He says it was me in a monkey suit. And his name is, worse than mud in the Squatcher movement. Like he is a total pariah. So the fact that we interviewed him for the show as the Squatcher is pretty pissed. A lot of them.
In your opinion, was it him?
I think it was him. He's pretty convincing,
Yeah.
Yeah.
What can you say about northern Mendocino County, California?
I've gone camping in northern Mendocino. Before I worked on this show, I went camping in the redwoods in northern Mendocino County, and all I saw was the natural beauty of the place. I can't.
Yeah, it looks gorgeous.
It is amazingly beautiful, but I'll never see that place the same way again because I know how many bodies are buried in those redwood forests. It's an incredibly dangerous place to go off the beaten path within it all. Meaning, like, you do not want to be venturing onto dirt roads off state highways in northern Mendocino County. And most of that is because of the weed business up there and a certain subset of criminal that is drawn to that sort of get rich quick opportunity. The violence up there has not subsided with the legalization of weed, like really at all. If anything, the competition and the ripoffs are as fierce as ever. Because the price of weed per pound has been driven down. And that means that, frankly, times are hard and a lot of people are desperate. So it's, northern Mendocino County can be a very, very dangerous place.
Now, do you feel years back there was a touch of innocence to it, to where the hippies went out there to kind of get off the grid, grow their weed and have a peaceful life. And then it just kind of just corrupted after that?
You raise a really good point, man. And that, like, the stereotype or the image that most people had, and the one that I had when I went to college in Santa Cruz, the late 80s and 90s, I always envisioned like the weed growers in Mendocino and Humboldt County as this sort of like utopian community of back to the land hippies that were like growing weed to this awesome weed to fund their back to basics, off the grid way of life. And that's always been there, and it's still there to this day. There's still people growing cannabis in Mendocino, Humboldt County, and Trinity County up there in the Emerald Triangle that are really, really good people and that are just like back to the land types, you know? But what started happening like around, most of them that will put it around the late 70s, like a couple things happened. One, the price of weed started to go up. And that happened all through the 80s into the 90s. And suddenly they're like, you can get several $1,000s per pound for Northern California weed on the East Coast. So all of a sudden there's a lot of money involved. Okay. The other thing that happened is that cocaine became a big thing in the US, and growers up there, they started to trade coke for weed or weed for coke. And once you introduce coke into the equation, like things took a darker turn in some facets there. And then like there was so much money involved that it started to draw people, like for the back to the landers, like the criminality was secondary to the way of life. When the price per weed hits $4,000, $5,000 a pound, that starts to draw criminals for whom criminality is the whole point. Meaning they're not there to put down roots and raise their kids off the grid eating organic food. They're there to make as much money as they possibly can, as quickly as they possibly can. And if you get in their way, they're going to put a bullet in your head and they're going to bury you back in the woods. Okay. And it started to draw a lot of those types. Okay. And a lot of those types are still up there. I mean, you've got cartel operatives up there right now. You got biker gangs up there right now. And then you got just like garden variety thugs that are doing black market deals up there. So yeah, it's a great question. Yes, the back to the landers started it all. The back to the landers are still there, but even they have guns these days because they have to, because otherwise they'll get ripped off.
Yeah. Listening to the Grateful Dead with a AR-15 in your hand,
That's
right?
the truth of it, brother. Yeah.
Oh man, what do you think people's fascination there is with Bigfoot?
I think it's well, I think that throughout time, people, if we get in the series a little bit, people have had there's been a drive to attribute evil or misdeeds to mythical creatures, because it's a lot easier to think of it as being monsters doing these things to us rather than we people doing it to one another. But I think specifically to Bigfoot, it's just this, I mean, look, it'd be a much more interesting world if Bigfoot existed, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just this idea that obviously a close evolutionary relative of us has managed to remain largely secret and living deep in the woods. There's something like very attractive about that. There's something in that we'd all like to be Bigfoot. Right. And this like big and powerful and not to be fucked with, but also like by most accounts is kind of a gentle giant, unless provoked. And I mean, and look, Bigfoot's cool.
Yeah. Oh, I've got to ask, what is the story, behind the scenes story of that retired cop that said he saw a Sasquatch? He seemed like he was traumatized for life, man.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I went in to this series thinking Bigfoot stories are bullshit. And then you watch that guy's interview, you sit across from that guy, or you sit across from some of these people that are telling Sasquatch encounter stories, especially stories where they were terrified. And you're like, these people are not bullshitting. They at least think that they're telling me the truth right now. So to answer your question about that guy, one of two things. One, either that happened and he saw a Sasquatch or some sort of otherworldly supernatural creature that scared the daylights out of him, or something else horrible happened to him that his subconscious has twisted around to an easier version to deal with. That easier version being it was a mythical creature. I don't know which one of those is true, but what I think is definitely not true is that he was just fabricating that. I don't think you can fabricate that kind of emotion. Yeah.
What was the biggest frustration with Sasquatch of connecting stories together or dead ends?
Well, the most frustrating, most challenging maybe is that a lot of the, like if it didn't happen on camera, if I couldn't get it to happen on camera, or if I couldn't get it to happen in a phone call that we could record, then like it kind of didn't happen for the purposes of making a documentary. There's a couple conversations that we felt were so key that we represented them with animated sequences, but there were things that I learned in the course of reporting that story or digging into that story, okay, about 3 guys being killed by a Bigfoot on a weed farm, which I could never say with a straight face. But there were things that I found out about that we had no way of representing in the show, you know, so that's frustrating, right?
Who did the animation? That was fantastic.
Yeah, his name's Drew Christie. He's an animator based in Seattle. Yeah, he's terrific. I mean, he just like nailed it. Like we didn't know the director of the series, Josh Rofe, you know, found this guy and thought he could be awesome, but we didn't know, you know, whether or not he would be able to get it or whether or not it was going to work. But like within the first few minutes of getting the first sort of proof of concept drawings of his, we were like, oh yeah, this is definitely the way to do this. And this is definitely the right guy.
Yeah. Oh, he nailed it. He nailed it for sure. Speaking of Rofe, you collaborated with him before. That relationship I know can be very difficult. You have to be very trustworthy of each other, especially if the story is yours. And how well do you guys work together? How did you create that relationship?
Josh and I get along great. You know, we originally met. We worked on a development gig for a cop show, a documentary cop show that didn't get picked up. But the great thing that came out of it is that Josh and I became friends and collaborators. And so, we've worked together on Sasquatch and then on Lorena, which was a doc series about the Lorena Bobbitt case.
Oh yeah,
it was on a couple of years ago. He really he saw the potential in Sasquatch before I did. Like he really had to convince me to work with him on that series. And then once I realized what my on-camera role was becoming, to be honest, I never trusted the idea 100%, but I always trusted in Josh's ability and his story judgment. So I had faith in him, but I didn't necessarily have faith in the show that we were making, just to be honest,
right.
Because it was like, I was like, man, you really you want to have me on camera? Okay. If you think it's going to work, okay. You know, you want to make a show about trying to find out whether there's any truth behind what may or may not be a legend about 3 guys getting murdered on a weed farm by a Sasquatch. Okay, Josh, I'll roll with you, man. And I'm really glad I did. I mean, it turned out really well. You know, it did work. It did work. He saw it in a way that I didn't.
Well, what's the future for you? Have projects you're working on now? Anything you can talk about? Or
I'd like to. I've been. I think it's time to write a book. I think it's time to write a book that's sort of like a collection of war stories from the 90s, but also sort of written through the perspective of a male survivor of childhood sexual assault. I think it's that time finally. But I'm working on a few doc projects right now. Probably there's one case that I wrote about in 2002. 2002. That was about a murder of a drug dealer in Denver. And that's one that's another one of those stories that I never really felt like I did all I could with it at the time. Like there was deadlines and, there was a paper to put out. And at a certain point I had to stop reporting that story, publish what I had and move on with life. But it always stuck with me. And I'd really like to go back and take another crack at that one because it feels solvable. And also it's just, there's a personal story that was going on there too, which is at the same time I was investigating one murder, I was secretly plotting to commit one. So I think there's a duality there that could make for a really interesting show.
Nice. As always, I can't wait for it, man.
Cool. Glad to hear that.
David, thank you so much for talking to me, man. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you for having me on.
Hey, my pleasure. And wherever you are, enjoy yourself.
All right, you too. Thanks.
Thanks so much, David.
A DaVinci Life.